Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast. I'm your podcast host, Peter Ahmad, recording from Cape Town, South Africa since June 2019. The Talking Transformation podcast provides an open and accessible platform for built environment professionals and interest groups to share their reflections and aspirations relating to the transformation of places and spaces in South Africa. It's intended to be a celebration of the individuals and community groups who are supporting formal and informal processes that are addressing the challenges of South Africa's history and shaping the future of our neighbourhoods and cities. Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast and to this first dual medium episode where we're using both video as well as the audio version of the episode. I hope you'll be as excited as I am to try this new format. I've been really eager to introduce a visual element to the podcast to really showcase great graphics and the content of many of our guests. And, this has involved quite a lot of learning from my side, a bit of upskilling to make sure that the quality and the content adds value and gives the viewer or the listener, the value that you're looking for from this podcast. So this is the first time I can say welcome listeners and welcome viewers. And this first podcast of the dual medium introduces the Wakamoso team in Dr. Melani Prinsloo and Mike Mathews, who have been really inspiring around the way that they're using data within the community to, on the one hand, grow the social and economic networks within the communities, and secondly, really to add value to the understanding of those communities and ultimately the economic performance, even using that to drive the underlying statistics and numbers, data, networks associated. So today we discuss the potential to harness grassroots data. Often we talk about big data, particularly within the public sector, but this is a really different approach, and they'll talk about things called the data commons to improve this understanding, the data linkages, and strengthen those networks and value within the community. I really hope you'll enjoy the episode. Hope that the dual visual and audio medium will really land well with the existing Talking Transformation community and hopefully grow this community through the YouTube channel. Most importantly, enjoy the episode, enjoy the conversation and insights from Melani and Mike. And if you've enjoyed the episode, please do tell your friends about it, tell your colleagues. Please do share, like and subscribe, and we look forward to our next episode. In the meantime, enjoy this episode. So here we are, it's May the 1st, it's a public holiday here in South Africa, and I'm absolutely delighted to be with Dr. Melani Prinsloo and Mike Mathews from Wakamoso. They're here today to talk a bit about the work that they're doing, some of the interesting approaches to data, and how that can be utilized from the ground up, really working with communities and trying to understand something that they call the data commons. And I'm looking forward to understanding a bit more about what do you mean when we talk about the data commons and the approaches that you've taken, the partnerships that you're working towards. But first of all, thank you so much for being here. Greatly appreciated. And perhaps, Melani, do you want to kick us off in terms of what is your story, what's your background, and what brings you to this side?
Oh, Peter, thank you so much for the invitation. Really lovely to spend this time together on this rainy day as well. So let's talk about when we started off. I started off on community-based research about in 2005. And a lot of the drive was running a research company. And I just saw that how easily we got employed to do research from the middle to the upper end of the market, but often how people grapple with challenges of designing products and programs and services for more marginalized communities, but then the lack of funding for that type of research, very small samples, a lot of stereotypes, mental models playing out, and at the end, companies kind of getting disillusioned with failures in the markets, but also communities feeling abused, people coming in and leaving. And I mean, that's many years ago. And what we looked at is to say, but if you use a normal research modeling, you're not going to be able to cost it in that. It's just the markets are too large. And if you are costing per interview, it's going to be way expensive. We are never going to get up the diversity. There's just so many dimensions of people's lives that we will never be able to account for that. So what we did at that point in time is we said, but what if we run a research project as if it's an employment project? So we then employed 500 people across the country that lived in unevenly developed areas. And because it was an employment project, we had to, of course, then have a research project every month, because that's what people are employed to do in their local areas, local languages, cultural matches. And on that, we then started saying that, okay, 1 month is my money, and then the next my technology, my life, in that my entertainment, my health, my education. And we started to create these stories through this employment project. And very quickly, we realized the power of what we started to see. To say, oh my word. So the study was syndicated. It was most of the banks, people like ShopRite and Mathews and Microsoft was the main clients behind the syndicated project. And we would deliver on a monthly case the story of this more informal world that was created. And that kind of created the context. But very soon what we realized is somebody like ShopRite would, for example, give us a brief. And based on the data we've collected, we would have already been able to answer it 60%. And you run a couple of extra focus groups, so you also started seeing how the cost savings start coming in, but also the reliability goes up because you understand the context of the community that they are trying to understand, rather than this isolated research projects that is coming in that can so easily be misunderstood. And that has been kind of my life since 2005.
And Mike, if that's the background from, let's call it the grassroots community development angle, I've always seen you as more the tech guy in the room. Is that a fair description?
I've had a tech journey, but I've also had one which has been trying to make impact in communities. So I lived in the Lowveld, started a music academy, trying to get kids in the local townships participating in music, and we ran quite an effective program. And out of that, I built because we had no money, I built a tech solution to deliver training and do attendance and do reporting and M&E type things. And that then grew into an online school, which then became the M10 online school. And then after COVID, I opted out of that. Well, during COVID, it was a good time to get out of it. So my background has been fairly tech, but also very focused on how to make a change within marginalized communities. And then I met Melani because I'd been visiting a friend here in the Western Cape, and his next door neighbor had sold their house to somebody from Cape Town. And he was curious as to how they did it, because there were no title deeds in the area. So then I thought, well, that would be an interesting one. And I've been playing with an idea around your own property as an asset and trying to work out what the real value of your property could be based on what was happening. And then it dawned on me that actually there's a significant number of South Africans without title deeds for whatever the reason was. And then I met Melani because Melani did the research on our title deed space. And that's when we kind of had two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, which we went, okay, well, if we put these two pieces together, we could have something more than what we've got. But it did take quite a lot of time, even after that, to try and flesh out what it was that we were building. And I think that's one of the difficulties of trying to communicate what we're doing, is because it's quite a complex thing to understand. So trying to sell it in simple language often comes across, people say you're too academic. But the issue is like, how do you create something which is of that complexity, which makes it simple for people to use? And that's been our biggest challenge, which I think we've mostly cracked.
We met, I think it was about 18 months ago, up in Ekurhuleni, there by Oa Tambo, and we were introduced via the Kaya Lam Foundation, Terry Markman and his team there. He said, apparently there are people as interested in this issue of title deeds as yourselves, who he'd met with, and then myself, that some of the work that I'm doing with Terry. And it was very obvious that you had a really interesting approach to that idea of working with that community from the, I keep using that phrase, but the grassroots, but building this sort of layer upon layer approach of understanding not just the social network, but the enterprise and the values within that. And I always remember, please take us back to that, Melani, where you were talking about the ability through the social network of your next door neighbor being able to vouch for you living in that for a period of time, and that being worth something, and having almost not transactional value, or at least an endorsement value as much as an affidavit from the cop shop. Am I remembering it right? And perhaps you want to expand on that.
Yeah, so that was an interesting conversation, because at that point in time, we started looking at the formal system of title deeds and saying, but how relevant could a system like that be in a very informal area where there's often a lot of more customary rules, in that there's tradition in place. There's a whole lot of beauty in place actually around ownership. And via the research we did for Mike, we were more keenly aware of that, but also because of the years of research, we could position it within that context. And then we started saying that, okay, but what if we do not come to a solution via our, shall we say, westernized ideas of how systems or formality should work, and rather have a look at how often people acknowledge one another within a community, and could you then use technology to do the same? So in a way, you can then say Wakamoso then becomes like almost like a pre-titling assessment tool. And the idea is then to say, okay, so this is my house, because Wakamoso goes to a very granular level, a street level of data, where people are self-reporting on a lot of their own things, whether it's their CV or their home or their will or the likes of. So if we look at the property, the person will say, this is my house, and I take a photograph of my house. And then the system will ask to say, okay, who's your neighbors in terms of it? And it says, oh, Peter's my neighbor and Mike is my neighbor. And the system can then say, Peter's Mal your neighbor, in that Mike is Mal your neighbor. And then it says, oh, Peter, but you also want to register your house from that site. You also want to register my house. Who's your neighbors? So that would be the beginning of that, where you are someone because of the community that you live in. And many times in the research, people are saying, but, you know, a house is not just an asset. It would be like a form of social violence to say a house is only an asset, because a house is your belonging within a community. And your belonging is determined by your neighbors allowing you to taking up that space. And if that space could be a bit of more fluid space, so you have more children, so you take a bit more land. He's got a crop growing, so he's using a bit more land. Now the crop is over, so there's more communal space again. So it's more of a fluid space that exists. And we started asking, how do you capture that in tech at the end? And then say, Mike loves to say always that actually a title deed is just the story of the property. And what is the story that we could tell in a tribal trust land or the likes of? That would be a valid story and saying, this is really my house. So I upload my documents, payments that I've made, rates and taxes, anything, the permission to occupy from the local chief. All of these things then become the story of my property and my house.
And if we think about the other side of that, the dimension, sort of if the living dimension that you're describing of the household, the working dimension, Mike, in terms of the work that household is generating, either through informal or formal means, and the ability then to build up a profile of the sort of economic data and profile of not just the household but the neighborhood. And I think you've looked at trying to develop CVs for the residents in those households as well. So it's this layer upon layer of information. But again, this is my own sort of, when we talk about data and big data, it's always this idea of, you know, a corporate, you know, what's the SASA information? What's our information that the banks hold? This is something different and coming from this level, and the economics is really interesting.
So the word data itself is such a confusing word, right? Because sometimes it talks about data you use for your internet, and sometimes it's information we gather, and then we view data as something we've done from a research perspective. But data is simply the recording of anything. Okay, sure. So it could be the recording of you running around the block. Okay, so now they can start to track one of the ironies is when all the military people are running around the block in Afghanistan and people are looking at Strava going, oh, well, there's the boundary of the military. So, you know, it was giving information they weren't even expecting it to give. So the issue is that now when you start to think about activities being recorded in a data world, we're gathering data of that activity, of that community, especially if it's geotagged. So one of the things is obviously your skills. For you, it's a CV. For looking from a different lens, because now the question comes is, this data commons idea. So if you think about a data commons as a soccer ball full of data, and depending on which hexagon you look through, it gives you a different view. So if I look through this way, it's my CV. But if I turn it around and I look at all the CVs in a community, it's a capability study. So now if you're a mine working in an area or coming to an area and you want to now start mining, you want the capabilities of the people who are there, because you need to understand what you need to train to close. But if you don't have the data, now it just becomes a guess, right? So you advertise a job and try and attract people who will fill those jobs, rather than focusing the economic or your training effort on the local economy to empower the local community. So the issue is just like, how do we gather all these data points? So at a personal level, one of the things is, if I look at my home and my assets and my skills, if those improve, it's an indicator of my well-being or my economic well-being improving. But it's not just that. There's spiritual insights, there's nutrition, there's health, so if you start, there's education. And so the issue is if you can start to build up this wider set of data, you could almost start to understand the community health. Okay, so if you could do that at a ward level across the entire country. Now when you start to run a question around, why is my shop working in Pretoria but it's not working in Mbombela, you can go, well, the Pretoria community is, amber, and the Mbombela one is red, or whatever the case is. And it's not just red, it's red because of training or security, so you can start to identify what it is. Because now you're starting to get data insights, real insights into community health, which then give relevance to the questions that you're asking, because you invariably will get different answers to your questions based on the underlying context that question should be framed in. And if you don't understand the context, the question itself becomes irrelevant. But the absurd thing is that a lot of the data sets that exist, there's a lot of data, right? So universities are conducting data or research, everyone's conducting research on an ongoing basis. But the data tends to be siloed. And we tend to protect the data we've gathered as if it's some major asset. So the question comes is, how do you create a data sphere, right? Those data commons in which you participate. And the more in which you participate, the greater value the data sphere has. So the more role players playing in the single data space, then you can start to get transdisciplinary insights. You can start to get longitudinal studies, there's tracer studies. I'm not a researcher, so I always get the wrong words.
Well, that's
Melani. But the point is if you're gathering this data, so it's important to understand, now the question comes is, how do you gather data as a conversation? So as Melani was talking about the story of your house, it's like, I paid this month, I paid that next month, I improved this thing this month. That is a conversation around the house, and that conversation is valuable.
If I can come in there, because that is actually a very fascinating point. Working in research, I think it's the thing that we don't always want to admit is often you are analyzing a research report and you went to all the trouble. You did the focus groups, you did the interviews, you did the questionnaire design, it was checked, it was tested. Now you're analyzing it, then you think, oh, flippin' hell, we should have asked the following 3 questions as well. And it's impossible from a cost perspective and many other levels to now ask those 3 questions. So what we have built is a conversation rather than a research tool with a person. So now we can take that same sample and say, thank you so much, Peter, for those things that you get told us last week. It is very, very valuable. Do you mind just answering the next 3 questions as well? And the value of your data improves, because otherwise it always goes into, as from the academic side, the last part of the research is always like recommendations for future research, and that's everything you forgot to do this time, or predicting.
As opposed to, can we implement on the back of what we learned?
Yes. Where now it's a case of both from a cost as well as a process perspective. It's easy as pie to go back and to say, we need the following insights as well, and where that value then enhances. But more than that, I can look at it through a lens that says, what does this mean for banking? Where somebody else comes into the commons in that, what does this mean for the jobs of social workers? One of the things that we're looking at, there's 8,000 unemployed social workers in a country like this. It's ridiculous that there are unemployed social workers. So I can take the same data sets, but I look at it and says, so which of these problems could be addressed with micro jobs for social workers? And because we know where the social worker is and we know where this community is, we can connect the dots to send this social worker to that family to say, people are struggling with an ID in terms of that, or there was GBV reports in. And that becomes endlessly fascinating. So at the moment, we're really trying to build this menu at the end. So it'll start off by saying, create a profile, here's your CV, here's your registration of your home, your registration of your business, your will, and then it does incident reporting in, and then it does infrastructure damage in your area in. And every one of those are elements that goes into the data commons, and it creates layers and layers of data of understanding of the community. So it empowers the actual user, the data subject on that side, but it gives layered or contextual understanding on the decision maker or the policy maker or the government side on that, where you have a holistic picture of that. And over time, what we hope is that you could see the levers to say, this is the lever of change for these type of communities. And because they're unique. And we like this, companies love it's the township markets. And
that's a broad church.
Yes, very much so.
But it's an interesting thing, because if you start to build these metrics up, so community health metrics, whatever they may be, and you identify them for every community. So every metric that is failing is a pain point of the community. So for instance, we were at AITSA, and it seems that security is by far the biggest pain point. But the point is, every single pain point of a community is a business opportunity. So if you, depending on how you look at it, and it's not a rescue thing, it's like, how does the community address this pain point? Because this is in fact an opportunity for people to be constructively employed within their own community. And so the issue is by identifying community health and identifying a strategy around what needs addressing, and then you can begin to address it with the community members, which in fact is economically positive for the people who are doing it, right? So it's healthy for the community on multiple levels. And then what is interesting, I mentioned the AITSA thing. We went there yesterday. We had 40 people from the community, and how one of the questions was around, can they rely on their neighbour? And I think the overwhelming thing was no. But it was because we don't speak to our neighbours. So now that for them to be sitting around tables and having these discussions, we're like, oh wow, the number of opportunities is huge. The fact that I can engage with you is the first step on this journey of addressing community pain points. So the issue from a policy perspective is you could in fact identify community pain points and then provide the framework to help the community actually actively themselves address those things. So the economic sort of behind the scenes, which is hidden, there's a huge economic potential to understanding through data what a community actually faces.
And when people start talking to one another, the solutions come up themselves. With the councillor being there yesterday, she sat there and we had a local lady, Lindy, was doing the food, and the food was beautiful and everything was really lovely. And she was saying that she had a high tea recently, and it would have been so amazing if Lindy was registered in that on the municipal database. So what we then said, but what is possible is, do you want to register on the municipal database of suppliers? Could be one of your menu items. Now the Lindys of the world can say, I'm doing cookies, I'm doing catering, here's some photographs of my things. And via that, she registers at the City of Cape Town. Now, Beverly needs to do something in AITSA, and she says, who are the people that are going to do tea? Oh, they are going to do tea. Who are the people that are going to do the catering? They're going to do catering. And suddenly, the community also feels involved. So, my word, City of Cape Town contacted me to do that, because so often we would just bring in external caterers to come and do something.
Sure. I mean that ingredient that you've described is, the trust of one's neighbour, trust of the municipality, trust which equates to government, and we know that those things are broken at the moment. So that ability to knit together, and I mean, it would be interesting to follow up with your caterer from yesterday in a month's time. Was she able to get registered on? Because that's the one thing to say. I offer you the chance. Yes, please. But how easy is it to plug in? Because, we need this, we need this, we need this.
We spoke about that exactly yesterday. And it's not just there. And some of the other work with the City of Cape Town, we have to look at the ECD registration.
Yeah, another classic example.
My word. what an ECD needs to do in
That's an early childhood development centre, yeah?
Yes. So it is ridiculous the amount of places they have to register with, the type of documents they have to get, and sometimes somebody's just a day mother. A person that works up in Nigeria, he explained it to me beautifully. They call it the degrees of formality. And shouldn't registration also work like that? If I'm a day mother, surely I'm not under the same requirement as a full ECD set on terms of it. What do we want? We want the kids to be safe.
Safety first.
Yeah. So, and that is true. So the way that we are registering the smaller shops at the moment, and are we sure that that's going to bring food safety? On
But
that
it's
side?
interesting because
To
everything's
ask the
very
right
siloed.
questions.
So from the ECD side, you've got obviously Department of Basic Education, you've got Department of Social Development, you've got the municipality, and now we come back to the issue of titling, right? In order for me to use this building as an ECD centre, I need to go and have a title deed on it so I can change its use from residential to now an educational facility.
Sure.
But if I don't have a title deed, I can't do the transfer, which means that by definition, I cannot have an official ECD because I fail at one of the legislative steps. So that now becomes, so if you look at it from that perspective, I don't have business rights for the spas or shops. I don't have liquor rights for the shebeens. All of these things are now open for abuse because they don't have the piece of paper that allows them to do what they're doing because they can't.
The good people are turned into
So
criminals.
now you are turning honest people into people making law.
And so often it would be the case that the lack of a title deed is not the fault of the occupant or beneficiary if we're talking RDP type housing.
But the absurdity is a title deed is simply a story. The final decision maker around whether you actually own it would be a court. So if I questioned whether this in fact was your property, we'd have to go before a judge. And now the question comes is, what is the story that has the most legs? Okay. So if I rent your property, you can't really evict me unless I find somewhere else to go because I've got a very compelling story to stay or whatever the circumstances are. So we must understand this world we live in is one about stories. And we got title deeds and title deeds are important to people who title deeds are important to. But they're title deeds to properties which have been transferred multiple times on an affidavit. You've got title deeds.
If that.
So you've now got people, so we know in the deeds office, there are names on title deeds that do not reflect the owner. There are names on title deeds that do reflect the owner. There are names on properties that just don't have an owner. In fact, the properties itself is not registered. So if you think about all the informal areas, the tribal trust areas rely on permissions to occupy. They're multi-generational family homes, and they don't belong to a single person. They belong to the family unit because it's a place that the family goes. So now a cadastral system needs a person's name attached to this deed, and if you want to change it, I need to get a lawyer and a whole lot of other people involved at great expense, which most people living in rural or unevenly developed areas don't have, in order to change it to another person. But the fact is, it's not that person who owns it. It's the family's place of being. So these are stories that, our Roman Dutch law roots do not account for in an African space. And the question really comes is, how do we create the stories that have substance, which provide security, which people like, and I'm talking more perhaps at institutional levels, recognize as being valid. They recognize your title deed, but they don't recognize the fact that you've been living there for 5 generations as being a claim to that property.
One of the challenges for many communities is accessing finance and the banking and the financial institutions. And how can this approach that you as Wakamoso have been thinking about start to build, I'm using that word again, trust, confidence and credibility within that banking sector to say, just because you're living in a situation without title deed and with minimal employment that is recognized as formal, but nevertheless generating some. How can we start to build that conversation with the financial institutions?
Critical. One of the things that I think one can view it from multiple directions. On the one side is this family house, 4 generations staying in the same place. You go to the bank and the bank says you've got nothing. So what is we surely have to just pause there for a moment to say, what does that mean in terms of just as a humanity, as a person, as my visibility in a system, that this is real for me. This has been our safe space in that, and you tell me I've got nothing. So how we disown people.
Lack of humility,
Yeah,
humanity.
yes. So just from a dignity perspective, how are we going to work with that? That would be absolutely amazing. But that's not the only problem. On the other side, for the banks, it's also terrible. They are denying an asset at their own detriment because they love collateral on that side. So in some of the conversations that I've seen with banks, they're really keen to address this issue. I just think many times we default to what we are familiar with and say that, and many things are coming up in that where people are saying, but how can you want me to register a house in my oldest child's name? I want the house registered in all my children's name on that side. We don't account for that, and it would be very expensive to do that. It makes a complex process even more complex. It's the same problem with the will. We want to say, who does this belong to? And the possibility to all my children. And it is a collective ownership, and we lack that. So it is really about connecting the dots, but via the community, rather than trying to formalize everything. And that's why I love that concept of the degrees of formality, and that we have to be able to understand what is relevant or appropriate on these different levels.
But there's a couple of other things. So the one interesting thing is that there needs to be some mechanism around ownership, because you will find people will sell properties that they claim to own, which they don't. So now in an informal setting, you have no confidence in buying that property because you're not sure that that person in fact owns it, okay? Because there is no evidence, there's no story around the property. So you do so at your risk, basically. The other thing is, like we speak to the universities, there's a lot of work being done in alternative credit scores, in alternative property ownership models, because we are trying to build something that is relevant to the place in which we live. Okay, so we don't live in London or Paris or Copenhagen. We live in Africa, right, where we've got a huge range in all dimensions. So the question is, how can we build something that has relevance for the entire ecosystem? And it needs to be user-friendly and it needs to be doable. So from, one of the simple things is you could start to build this social network. And it's not an easy job. It's a massive job to do. So, and we are just at the very beginning doing a pilot in the Cape Town. So the point is you can build the social network. And depending on how many people have validated themselves, each time, if my neighbors are validated, that's a greater claim to my story. If they validate it, that's even a greater claim. So now how many of these things are there? So I can say, well, I'm sitting with a 90% confidence that you in fact own your thing. So if you now transact, we will ensure the buyer's money that you in fact do own the property. And then you can have a simple mechanism, because the reality is they transfer on an affidavit. So transfer on an affidavit and move the money and do it in a safe way and provide an insurance. So maybe somebody's willing to pay 1,000 Rand for the insurance to cover their buying money based on the possibility this person doesn't own it, but you know that you've got a very strong case to say that this person does in fact own it. So how do you start to reinvent these models? And it's not just on the property side. It's on the credit score space, So, speaking to some of the research Melani's done, people will be borrowing money from the local loan sharks in preference to borrowing money from the bank, because in their mind it's more expensive to borrow money from the bank. So whatever this, but so the question is, there's a big disconnect happening in this space, which I think can be unlocked if we can build the stories to support the transactions we're trying to facilitate.
Yeah, if I can come in there, because that is actually quite fascinating. So at some point in time, we were looking at, one of the banks asked us to look at people who qualified for a home loan, but they didn't get, they qualified for a home loan, but they never took the home loan, but they did buy the house. And the question was how? Because we are not a country that's massive in savings and the likes are. And then in investigating that through this community-based research methodology, a lot of fascinating things come out. But to link what he was saying is So we say, okay, then how did you buy the house? And the person will say, no, I ended up taking a personal loan from several banks, and I got some money from friends and family. Friends and family charges interest in, and then from the machinistas in that massive that. And then you look at this and you say, oh, because the person would say, no, it's too expensive to work with a bank. And then you're like, oh my word, but the bank is going to charge you X amount and you're now paying Y, and this is a lot of more money. They say, no. If I can't pay that home loan, the bank is going to take my house back, and that's very expensive. So we look at interest rates. That person, and then the bank says, yeah, we have to go and train people on the understanding of the importance of an asset. That's the thing that the person understood to a T, the importance of the asset. I am willing to take this the most terrible interest rates in so that I can secure the asset, because the one thing the person cannot do is somebody can't take the house back. You just keep that debt alive. You don't fully service it. If you keep the debt alive, it's very difficult to take that house back. So yes, it does create security in the purchase of the house at
exorbitant rate.
Again, making poor people poorer.
One of the real eye-openers for me over the last couple of years, looking at the title and the tenure issues, has been, we so often think of, I need a house, so what do? I look at Property 24, I look at what's online. And of course, that's within a particular market and price range, etc. Facebook Marketplace, there's a whole world going on there around transactions of what we would call shacks or informal structures, some of which, or even RDP units, which are being stated, has title deed, does not have title deed. And there's this whole sort of ecosystem and world that exists beyond the pages of, I'm thinking back to the days when you'd buy the newspaper and you'd flick through, the Sunday supplement. There's a whole world out there that's transacting, as you say, right now, with degrees of risk / assurance, and you factor that into the price that's been offered, and it was a real eye opener to me that these things. We've always heard the story of the RDP house that was sold for next to nothing, and certainly nowhere near the cost. But I think that's increasingly apocryphal as opposed to what's actually happening out there.
But those RDP houses, from what I understand from the research, there was a delay on issuing the title deed to them. You could get this
or never issue.
So you'll get this after 8 years to ensure that you stay here. But the point is, this person's reality is, it's like, I've got a job over there. I don't need this title. So then they swap us. Yeah. So now you start doing transactions. And it was interesting in the city of Cape Town, the one person we were talking to is saying, we're trying to get people title deeds. But by the time we come to deliver the title deed, somebody else lives there. So the title deed is already out of date. So now the question comes, is it does not represents our reality, and the cost is significant. Whether it's KLM or anybody else doing this, they're doing it at a cost of thousands of rand per. When in fact, how do you allow this thing to fluidly happen, where you are kind of tracking the stories of the transactions and the stories of the people who are involved in the transactions in a fluid way? And it is definitely possible. I think the biggest driver for it is who is going to recognize it. If you can get some authority to recognize that, then you can totally flip the game changer. But at the moment, the sort of, I'm guessing the ultimate authorities are possibly
the banks and the municipalities. Surely are the two.
But you need to understand, the municipalities don't know who lives in the houses. Okay, so I'll give you an example. In Eitzach, where we've been doing this work.
Tell us a bit about that.
And we must understand that some things are said because they are nice to say, maybe not based in fact. That we were told it was pit latrines. We were told that it's there's up to 60,000 people living in this 1 square kilometre area. That there's high unemployment, the highest TB rates in the country. There's a whole
pretty grim description.
Right in the middle of Cape Town, right? So Melani describes it as Cape Town's Alexandria Township in a way, because it's accessible to work, but it's cut off. There's no taxis go there, no buses go there, and it's right next to the airport. The reality is not that at all. And the most interesting thing for me is we've had these 10 ambassadors, which are paid by the city, going around recording this data we've been gathering. And they came to us and said, behind every door, there's a business. This place is rife with businesses. We didn't know there were so many businesses. Now, when one of the stories were told, there's no economic activity happening here. But just ask yourself the question, how is it possible for 20,000 people to live in a square kilometer and not have any economic activity? It's by definition not possible. And that's another study that Melani did. And it's important to understand that if you say to somebody, do you have a job? And they go, no. Okay. And then you start to go, and that's an absurd question. You can't ask in a poor community if you have a job. That's an irrelevant question completely. You need to say, what did you buy this month? Well, I bought these 20 things. Well, how did you pay for them? And then you start to discover where the money comes from. So this is an important thing to understand. So people living in poor communities, besides paying way more for anything than anybody else does in the economy, they rely on multiple income streams. So every income stream is an important income stream. So now the question comes is, how do you build on that model through data? So if you could now, let's say a bank wanted to do research of people who privately own their property with a title deed and have let's say a geyser in their house because it means they've got running water and they've got electricity because they want to speak to them about possible financing their home, we could segment that and send a question to all that segment of AIDSA and say, if you answer this question, we'll pay you 30 Rand. Now you've turned your data into an asset. And if you do enough of that, that's another income stream in the hands of a poor community. But it's an asset to the business answering it because they want to know who can they actually provide funding to. So these are starting to be interesting things to understand, that is that poor communities rely on multiple income streams. And it's not going back to your thing around a mortgage, they can't rely on the 12 out of 12 payment. So the issue is, I go and get a bond, you can't insist that they're going to pay for 20 years 12 out of 12 because they've got no idea.
Awesome.
So we've got to bend these rigid rules we've created and start to actually provide some type of fluid space, which is not a space which you have to risk, you go to risk your money. It's just that actually you've got to address the realities of the area. I don't know, can I say weird? Can I give the weird acronym?
Yeah.
So you understand.
So permission, what is coming down?
Because she's a researcher. So I'm the typical white South African, right? I am that stereotypical white male from whenever. And Melani says you can't rely on a weird sample, and I'm the ultimate weird sample. I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, I'm not weird. I'm white. I'm educated. I come from an industrialized area, rich and democratic. Do not rely on a weird sample to make decisions around African problems.
And a lot of research has been done in weird.
So the point is, we need to understand there's a lot of weird people driving the economy who don't understand that actually the realities of Africa are not how they see it.
But also, if we see it as right and wrong, and not right and wrong, it's just different.
It's different, but it also has that degree, the right and wrong could equate to can access versus can't access, and that, I guess, is the big. That's a big differentiation. Exactly. The one thing I seem to remember when we chatted a couple of days ago was you were saying that the AIDSA example, this profile that you'd built up, which I said sort of sounded a very grim depiction, with lacking economy, etc. But the one thing that came out very strongly was your assessment, actually via the field workers, around the pit latrines, for example.
Yeah, so there was a narrative of this pit latrines. I think the 16 pit latrines out of 1,500 or 1,200 that we've sampled, and that could, in fact, I don't even know. We need to go check those pit latrines. They run waterborne sewage. The whole thing works on municipal services. It is extraordinary, but the story is a lot sexier if I say the whole thing runs on pit latrines.
The people like drama. Also, and I mean, communities have problems, and the problem is if some people then tell these things like on steroids. I mean, it's just pit latrines. It is like 3 or 4 times the amount of people. It's this. It is so scary when you look at this. And what is beautiful is then you then get the truth to say, well, there are problems to be solved. Of course, there are problems to be solved, but they are not as grim, and that you can actually use local solutions and things as well.
So it's about characterizing it correctly based on the data that's available, as opposed to making broad assumptions
so-
and sweeping
so-
statements.
But
in the absence of data.
But I think that's a thing that we have in our general conversations. People sit around a table and they start talking, and they've all got their anecdotal stories that they start to bring in. And, they're not grounded in fact. But we think that, from our perspective, that actually we're the most rational beings on the planet. And of course, what's coming out of my mouth is pearls of wisdom. But I'm weird. I don't know what is outside of my little bubble. I have a very small bubble. So now going to ASIC has been a great lesson in that thing, because I think there are other weird people with their views, but the reality is not the same. So, for instance, one of the things is there's a lot of government rental flats. On average, I think there's 7 people living in a flat. But in a house, a privately owned house, there's 4.5. So you can see, and then obviously the government rental flats, there's a section of not flats, of freestanding dwellings. They have a lot higher prevalence of backyard dwellings, because one of the big income drivers in poor communities are these backyard dwellings. So I know in our research in Alex, people were knocking down their houses to build shacks because they were earning 5,000 Rand per shack. So in the government rental units, there's a high prevalence of backyard shacks. But in the private dwellings, which is now privately owned and occupied, there's not, because maybe they don't want shacks. And maybe the economics of that unit is slightly different. So it's a fascinating thing to understand, because it is so layered that you can't come in with a single brushstroke and go, that is, this is the magic.
And how do you help people to do it better, rather than saying that backyard dwellings are wrong or right? Not wrong or right. People need income streams.
If what you have available is land, and even if it's a small in relative term, how do you make that land, whatever it is, as productive as possible in terms of financial?
How do we make it better for the backyard dwelling occupant as well as for the homeowner? So rather than putting threats out in, how do we have ideas? What if people can design modular units that people can put up easily, that are kind to humanity? What are the sanitary solutions? How do we make sure there's wash basins everywhere? And in that way, you create a healthier community, rather than fighting the community, and the community is merely trying to survive.
But the days of apartheid over the past of you can't be here are gone. The fact is, people are coming to urban centres. So now, how do you address that? You can't address it by going rigid rules and going, you can't do this, you can't do that. The reality is different. You look at the reality and go, how do we address the reality? How do we adapt what we're doing? The biggest thing with the backyard dwellings, going back to the latrines, is bucket toilets, because the lavatory in the house is accessed by the backyard dweller. But at night they can't, so then they have a bucket toilet for the nighttime things. So then the point is, well, maybe you start to provide public toilets which are maintained or something, which backyard dwellers can use, so if you want to eliminate bucket toilets. But these are at least based in the realities of what has happened. And I think that's one of the things, is that we can't construct a perfect and ideal world and then enforce it on a community, because that's not going to happen. This ideal world of ECD centers, you've got to have these 500. The compliance thing is, I would not be able to comply with it. But our education thing, we recognize, is in tatters. But the real travesty of education is at ECD level. If we can get the ECD right, the rest of it will follow in a better way, rather than throwing massive amount of money at matric pass rates, which is way too late. The horse is bolted. It's gone. We're now just painting the stable door to say, there was an opportunity lost.
Before we start to bring the conversation to a sort of natural close and talk about where people can find out more about the work that Wakamoso is doing and the website that you have and some of the initiatives that you're unpacking, tell us a bit about another of the case studies. I think, if I remember correctly, John, you mentioned it earlier about gender-based violence and how some of the data analysis and the research that they've done there has tried to make its impact in GBV.
I think, that's a good one to take. In the research that we've done around GBV, it's such a devastating reality. One of your most important things for people is just to actually report. And that is the first step to anything, of course. And Now, what something like Wakamoso then offers you is I can go on and I can do like a police report. It's like it goes through the steps of a police report on WhatsApp, and I go through that, and it'll ask me when it happened, time, evidence, photographs, witnesses, all of it, horrible. And then at the end, it'll say, would you like the police to know about that? And I can say no. Do you need help? And I can say no on that. And so now I have put it out there. But now, unfortunately, this has now happened 8 times. At some point in time, I can say I need help. And this is where Wakamoso then comes into its full rights, because at the end, we are just a big data gathering tool that lies there. So then we link up to the NGO that is doing the work on GBV. We're not GBV experts in that. To the social workers and all that is going to connect beautifully to the person to say this person now needs help, and there's evidence and there's a report of that. So much better understanding of what really happened on. So in every single one of the spaces, whether it's GBV or whether it is small businesses or whether it is, I don't know, infrastructure development and tracking and that, it is really about somebody using this massive data commons into their benefit, in where this person is the expert in GBV or the expert in whatever they are doing, and they are merely looking into it via that lens. So we don't become the expert, we are merely the reporting.
So I think it's an important thing that we've not really discussed, is that the Wakamoso is not us doing something. What Wakamoso is this cloud-based solution, which tenants come on and can run their projects. So community-based organizations could run their projects and manage their registrations. The tribal authorities could come on and register everybody within the tribal authority. And because a tribal authority is like a municipality, how do we provide better services? Municipalities could come on, businesses could come on. So, we are starting to collect CVs, and we've got more in Joburg than we have down here. But the point is, I can do a geolocation. I can put a polygon in, run my Melani, and search for people with an NQF5 who speak 4 languages. So you can, the point is, it's a multi-tenanted space. So we're not pretending that we have the solution. The question comes, we are presuming you're the expert in your area. Here's a tool for you to plug it.
Yeah.
And the interface that you mentioned a couple of times, I just want to make sure I'm understanding it right. Often using WhatsApp as the platform.
There's an app. People more and more do not want to download apps for various reasons. And so WhatsApp becomes a very easy, and people are very comfortable on WhatsApp.
It's becoming ubiquitous, right?
So it's literally about how you run a conversation on WhatsApp. So, and then Wakamoso creates documentation for you based on what you're doing. So this is your CV, you answer the question, this is the CV, and the lights up. But all of that then simplifies it. So what you need to really, I think, and technology allows it now, that the solution is extremely simple from the person's side, regardless of how complex it is at the back end. And it's like balancing those things.
So the biggest thing is how do you reach the most people? So you do it with TikTok, okay? But TikTok's not really relevant for what we're doing. The second to TikTok in South Africa is WhatsApp. So it's 28 million above people. Not all of them have got data that WhatsApp is active, but this is a reality of people without data. So I can't solve the data problem, but the point is I can reach up to 28 million people. One of the important things, as we said, in terms of the micro income is if I did something and I earned a reward for it, you can convert the reward into airtime. Because
and/or data, right? I mean,
airtime becomes data. Now, if you understand how poor communities work, airtime in South Africa is displacing food off the plate of the families. So if we can supplement airtime, we are improving the
ability to.
So we're addressing a major pain point. But the airtime, if you go back to the earlier conversation about Melani's field workers, when people start to connect and they engage, then they've got a greater chance of opportunity. So airtime is a critical step to getting outside of your isolation, being able to communicate with the WhatsApp. So all of these things can be reinforcing. The question is, the difficulty is to find those visionary players who are going to say, let's take that really high level look and see if we change these levers rather than our traditional levers, how we could do it.
Yeah, and if I come in there, one of the biggest lessons was early on in the program when we were just running everything on paper. what we saw is that our field force leaves. And initially we were like, oh my word, what are we doing wrong? And when we did kind of started doing exit interviews to figure out, but why is this happening? We realized that people are getting other jobs.
Yeah. It's that sort of secret of, was it the consequences of your own success, right?
Yes. And initially, where we were horrified, we thought like, oh my word, this might be the best insight of all. An unemployed person cannot get a job. But a person who has some income, some training, a bit of data on their phone, gets their own job. So maybe being the field force, being the data subject is an entry level into opportunity, and that becomes a conduit to multiple income streams, to other opportunities.
There's another interesting thing is if you look at it from your own freedom, you know, the Mathews said on freedom, people, even if they wanted to get in the taxi to go for a job interview, can't get in the taxi. Sure. So the question is like, how do you address people's unfreedoms? And if we can start to address unfreedoms, and one of the things our field workers in AITSA, there was a view that there were no businesses. Now they know behind every door is a business, which means now if I want to sell bulk flour, I can buy bulk flour and I can break it and distribute it to the people in my community. I can collect oil, you know, used oil from all the workshops, or I can sell parts. But they didn't know that. When at the beginning they were like, there are no businesses here. Now the people who live in AITSA are going, there's a business behind every door. So the interesting thing is that's the difference. It's like just suddenly opening up that ability to communicate, ability to see what is happening within their own environment. And that is possible through data. But if we collect enough data, we can create a thing on my tool, on my phone to go, I'm looking for a taxi near me, and it can show me all the taxi operators. I'm looking for a sewing machine, or I'm looking for a beekeeper. Whatever the case is, it's possible now with data.
Yesterday at AITSA, I think one of the questions I understand you were working with Ranyaka, and they were running the methodology, which I'm quite familiar with. One of the questions that would have come up that the 40 participants would have answered was availability of data and or comms. What was, is there any sort of what do you call it? Wi-Fi available to them there? Has that been installed? So what would happen to AITSA if one of the cellular guys came in? Yeah,
universal access would change the world.
If we flipped it around, right? We worked with Civiti Institute. They were training up digital ambassadors. You know, now the question is, what do digital ambassadors do? There's so much to be done. If you can give people data and you can get productive activity, we could create thousands upon thousands of jobs of people creating data for the invisible part of this country. So our most effective insights have been when we've had somebody on the ground going and collecting data. Every person on the ground collecting data is a job. And the value that they are providing is way more than the cost of what they are being paid. So the issue is, if we could create digital access, we would remove one of the biggest barriers to economic activity that exists in the country.
If we look at players like Five a Time and Too Much Wi-Fi and the likes of, we're R5 per day on the net. And so if more of those things become more available to people.
Game changer again. This has been fascinating. And again, I've really enjoyed picking up on some themes that we've discussed previously, and also introducing some really new stuff. And thank you for your sharing that with me. And where can people who might be watching this, and I've never heard of Wakamoso, I don't know Mike, I don't know Melani, where can they find out about the work that you're doing? And I know you've got a great website.
Yeah, the website is there. We are also busy updating it. You want to make sure as the project evolves, and Alex has got a whole lot of new ideas of how to make that better in the near future. We're also now going to start going out on a social media campaign. We were holding back on a lot of that. But within the next month or so, the social media campaigns will start running. Then we'll be stronger on LinkedIn and the live chat as well.
So it's Wakamoso Africa, wakamoso.africa.
So it's do you help the spelling there?
www.wakamoso, WAKAMOSO.Africa. So Wakamoso means the future one. So hopefully, even if Wakamoso is not the future one, the thinking could be possibly adopted as being a future one.
Thank you so much for your time today. enjoy the rest of, well, I guess this is a strange sort of, it's not a long weekend yet, but it feels a bit like that. But again, enjoy the rest of your time here in Cape Town, and thank you so much today for spending some time with me. All the very best to you.
Thank you so
Much
much.
appreciated.
That's okay.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. If you have enjoyed, please do like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Please do tell your colleagues and friends about the work that we're doing and the content that we're generating. We're forever indebted to Tribal Need for allowing us to use the track Flags as our main theme tune for this series. And if you have comments or suggestions, if you want to be part of the Talking Transformation podcast, please do reach out to us via talkingtransformation101@gmail.com or contact us through the Blue Sky platform at TTPod.